Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I think we have participants still settling in, so we can have maybe one more minute until we really officially kick off. Until then, just thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to a very interesting and very fruitful workshop today and tomorrow. So I think we can start. Good afternoon, everyone, again, and welcome to the joint JRC and the Sense and Elect Putting Science into Standards workshop. This year's workshop is on data quality standards for inclusive, non-biased, and trustworthy AI. On behalf of the Joint Organizing Committee from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission and the European Standardization Organization, CEN and CENELEC, I would like to thank all of you for participating, and we look forward to a fruitful workshop. We are especially grateful to the panel members for their contributions until now and for their contributions today and tomorrow. We would also like to thank our workshop advisory committee and all the stakeholders who we have engaged with in these past months to prepare the workshops. Before I give the word to our Joint Research Center Deputy Director General Bernard Magenhan and the President of CEN, Mr. Stefano Calzolari, I would like to go very quickly through the agenda of this year's workshop, day one, and also talk to you about our housekeeping rules. Since we are doing this workshop using both Zoom platform as well as Slido. So you can engage through Slido to ask questions. Just use the hashtag standards for AI as you see on your screen, or you can use the QR code. For the day one main session, you have to select the day one main room on Slido. In the Zoom chat, please only ask technical questions so that we are not overwhelmed. And we will choose from the Slido the questions to ask the speakers if we have time. Please also keep your camera and your audio off in order to save bandwidth. To go quickly through the program of this first day, as you know, the objectives that we have this year, especially in view also of the AI Act and the Digital Services Act, but most of all in view of the AI Act, we would like to in these 2 days to present current and future needs and recommendations to address data biases and related ethical concerns in the context of AI and the future AI Act. We would like to map existing and missing standardization efforts, and you will see during the panel sessions we will use some specialized, let's say, matrices that are mapping what exists and where we would like to go. We would like to support the developing of guidelines in view of the data quality standards for AI models, and we would like to have as a result a proposal and recommendation of concrete steps to start or complement the process of drafting these standards for data, especially for AI. So after our opening speeches, we will be welcoming Lucila Scioli, who is the director of DG Connect, and she will talk to us about data in the context of the AI Act. Further on, we will have an intervention from Gabriela Ramos, who from Unesco. She was not able to join us in person, but she sent a video, and we will be playing her intervention. Further on, we will have an intervention from OECD, from Karine Perzet. Further on, we will be talking about algorithmic bias consideration, and we have the US Standardization Initiative for Identifying and Managing Bias, both from the IEEE, represented by the chair, Ansgar Kuhne, and also from NIST, Reva Schwartz, who is the principal investigator for AI bias. Further on, we will have our colleague from DG Connect, Mr. Gabriele Mazzini, who is the team leader for the AI Act, and he will be talking about data requirements as outlined in the AI Act. We continue by inviting our colleagues from Sensenelect and ISO groups that are working on AI standardization, and they will be talking to us about standardization road mapping and European and international standards organizations. So further on today, we will have the two first parallel panels. The first one will be about creating and documenting data sets for AI. And here, as I've said, we will be mapping together with the panelists what exists, their experience, but also bringing their knowledge and their views on what has to be developed further. And at the same time, we will have a panel on data quality and bias examination and mitigation in AI. So this talking more about data as used in particular in AI systems and what happens inside these systems and post and in production and in deployment. So without further ado, I would like to invite our Deputy Director General, Mr. Bernard Magenhan, to have the formal opening speech. Thank you.
Alessandra, can you give me a little signal? Can you hear me? Super. Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, I would like to welcome you all to this workshop jointly organized by Sensenelec and the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. It's really a pleasure for me today to contribute to this opening session. The topic you will discuss today and tomorrow is at the forefront of the digital transition, which, as you know, is one of the priorities of this Commission. Artificial intelligence is a key enabling technology that is already changing our lives and in many ways. Artificial intelligence models are becoming more complex and are more widely used than ever before. Concerns on potential biases in artificial intelligence are growing, and they may negatively impact our lives. This is the reason why the European institutions have joined forces to protect and ensure a safe digital environment for our citizens. The Cybersecurity Strategy, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and the Data Governance Act are part of these efforts culminating in the Artificial Intelligence Act. Overall, quality data is key to generate trustworthy and non-biased artificial intelligence. The aim of today's Putting Science into Standards workshop is to explore how emerging science and technology on artificial intelligence can benefit from standardization activities to enable innovation and enhance industrial competitiveness. I'm really pleased that we have organized this workshop with our partners, Sen and Senelec, with whom we have a long-standing and fruitful cooperation. Merging in a complementary way our respective fields of expertise from the GRC side, scientific and technical support for policymaking, and from Senelec side, the development of European standards, fostering the European single market, global trading, and the welfare of European citizens and the environment. Standards are part of our respective lives and economies. They serve to make us safer, stronger, and more secure. And more, the Union has the ability to spread standards across the globe, which is earning global importance and contributes to Europe's strategic autonomy. In first instance, standards serve industry, for example, by facilitating interoperability among different components or by bringing new technologies closer to the market. And standardization also serves research by enabling the comparison of research results. In a few critical sectors, a European standard is developed by a recognized European standards organization upon request from the European Commission. We anticipate a series of such standardization requests aiming at supporting the Artificial Intelligence Act. Thanks to today's workshop, we can start building a partnership between the research and innovation communities and the European Standards Organization to valorize European research investments in artificial intelligence. You have a lot to discuss today and tomorrow, and I'm very pleased to see the high attendance of this workshop, representing researchers, innovators, regulators, standardization specialists, policymakers, and end users from industry, all combining rich expertise in data management and ethics in sectors such as finance, education, law enforcement, healthcare, robotics, and media. And I truly believe that we need this multidisciplinary expertise and insights in order to pave the way forward for the development of future standards and seize the full potential of artificial intelligence. I really wish you a successful and productive workshop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bernard, and thank you very much for joining us today. Next, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Stefano Calzolari, who is the CEN President, for his opening speech. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Alessandra, for giving me the floor. And many thanks to Bernard Magenan for opening this event with me and for his important introductory speech that highlights the value of our collaboration and the importance of the topic we are going to deal with. And of course, a warm welcome to this Putting Science into Standards Workshop 22. Also from my side, in my capacity as CEN President and CEN-CENELEC Innovation Champion. It is really a pleasure to have been invited to celebrate with you another important event dedicated to a subject that will be strategic in the coming years and even more in the medium-long term, as it will affect increasingly our life as European citizens and citizens of the world, let me say. I have many good reasons to be here today and to bring you the great appreciation of CEN-CENELEC for your important work with the standardization system. Putting Science into Standards is an initiative we started together with the European Commission Joint Research Center in 2013. Since the beginning, this initiative has proven to be a successful example of foresight activities aimed at the timely identification of emerging science and technologies areas, where standardization activities are required to enable innovation and promote industrial competitiveness. Past examples have shown that putting science into standards, sometimes is difficult to repeat the acronym, can be an effective incubation track for future standardization. This is crucial for our future goals. In fact, for CEN and CENELEC, in the framework of the new strategy 2030, a key priority for the next months and years is the strengthening of the EU's leadership in standard setting to support the global competitiveness of European companies, especially in strategic industries and innovation areas. To ensure the achievement of these lofty ambitions, it is key to include all relevant voices who share our objectives and can help put them into practice. In the current context, Europe must work to better translate research results into innovative products and services. To do that, it is key to ensure that new research and the outcome of innovative projects are duly supported and valorized. This means to be able to recognize scientific input into the standardization processes as being crucial in order to make standardization fit for the future. In other words, we recognize the great value of this collaboration in fostering pre-standardization activity that is setting the basis for the standards of tomorrow, identifying key innovative areas where new standards should be developed, playing a fundamental role, also in the light of the European priorities and needs for standardization, especially in the new fields, the green and digital transitions, where research and innovation are certainly the main drivers of the expected development of the civil society. Therefore, I am indeed glad that putting science into standards is acknowledged by the EU standardization strategy, issued earlier this year, as an important foresight exercise that explores standardization needs linked to emerging technologies. Even more, I am glad that establishing links with putting science into standards initiative has been identified as one of the key recommendations of the draft code of practice on standardization for researchers, which has been published by the European Commission in May 2022 and is currently under stakeholder consultation. And now, let me speak briefly about the workshop of the next 2 days. I am convinced that the topic selected for this year's edition of Putting Science into Standards is extremely timely. We are about to explore one of the most challenging frontiers of the applicable knowledge, the artificial intelligence, which should allow Europe to meet one of its priorities, to become fit for the so-called digital age. But each of us is aware of how difficult this path is, because we are going to manage a cutting-edge technology that could involve, together with the extraordinary advantages, unprecedented risks for people's lives and for some basic principles on which life is based today, especially when ethical dilemmas arise. In many cases, there is not just one way to answer, and you have to know how to choose the best solution or scenario for human well-being. Therefore, we shall be able to be a hub of trustworthy and excellent artificial intelligence. And in this perspective, I think that being citizens of Europe and citizens of the Western world will help us a lot to achieve this goal, because we know very well from our history and culture the value of freedom, democracy, and fundamental human rights. All this, let me say, implies on our part as European citizens a particular awareness and responsibility to promote a trustworthy and unbiased approach to artificial intelligence, which takes the benefit from this innovative technology in full respect of fundamental rights. Setting standards in artificial intelligence is gaining momentum, given the importance of developing an adequate framework and guidelines based on which AI systems can be developed, ensuring, I repeat once more, trustworthiness and mitigating ethical risks. CEN and CENELEC have undertaken the first step in the field with the creation of CEN-CENELEC Joint Technical Committee 21, Artificial Intelligence, in 2021, responsible for the development and adoption of standards for AI and related data, as well as providing guidance to other technical committees concerned with AI. Furthermore, Centric JTC 21 focuses on producing standardization deliverables that address European market and societal needs, as well as underpinning EU legislation, policies, principles, and values. Having said that, during this workshop, we expect to hear from all practitioners and researchers what are the critical points they face in their experience in using AI models, and launch a discussion on how standardization can be used to mitigate bias in AI models. The outcome of this workshop will certainly contribute to defining priorities for future standards that we will be called to develop, and Centric are ready to support the European Commission in its work related to fostering a safe and sustainable adoption of artificial intelligence for the well-being of European citizens. But of course, in developing new standardization activities, CEN and CENELEC also work to promote the international alignment of standards in the framework of technical cooperation agreement with ISO and IC. Let me say now some final words. The future global competitiveness of the digital single market, I'm sure, will depend also on the framework we put in place today with clear standards. Your work is of great importance, and I'd like to thank once more the JRC colleagues for putting forward this topic and for organizing this important event with us. I am also thankful to all the speakers who have agreed to invest their time in co-creating with us a successful event and ensuring a fruitful discussion. I wish you all 2 intense and productive days ahead. I wish you all a successful event.
Thank you very much for your kind and very inspiring words, and of course for joining us. Now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Lucilla Scioli, who is the director of DG Connect, and she will be talking to us about data in the context of the AI Act. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. I'm having some trouble with the video. Okay, I think it works.
We can hear you very well.
Thank you. And I think you can see me as well now.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I will just, first of all, want to thank both the colleagues from the JRC as well as CEN and CENELEC for organizing this workshop in support of the implementation of the regulatory framework on artificial intelligence. And I would just like to say a couple of words to remind a little bit why standardization is going to play such an important role for the implementation of the framework, which, by the way, is still under discussion with our interinstitutional partners, the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament. But I would like to remind where we've come from the side of the European Commission. Of course, for us, we have an objective for which we want to become one of the main developers of artificial intelligence and one of the main users of artificial intelligence. And in particular, we think that the European Union can exploit its comparative advantage in industrial settings. But we have run surveys and realized, of course, that one of the main challenges to achieve this objective is to increase the trust in the technology by their users, because artificial intelligence has a huge positive potential effect on our economies and on our well-being, but it carries some risk, and these risks come in particular when in terms of violating fundamental rights and safety. And so with our regulatory framework, we have tried to put in place the ambition of increasing trust in the use of artificial intelligence, and at the same time trying to minimize the burden on developers and users of artificial intelligence, in particular not to stifle innovation. And to do that, I think we have succeeded in proposing what we consider to be a proportionate approach and a proportionate framework. In fact, we do not propose to regulate AI as a technology, but to regulate the use of artificial intelligence in certain contexts, in contexts that we consider particularly risky. So from this point of view, we have put in place a risk-based approach, and we are very much focused on high-risk systems that we try to list in the annex to the regulatory framework. This is also to help the legal certainty of the developers that will have to comply with the rules of the framework. And the framework is actually following the structure and it inspires itself, let's say, to our product market legislation, which is a very well-known kind of legislation we have in the European Union that we have, where we have a significant experience. And we, a little bit, if you want, like the CE marking. So the artificial intelligence systems will have to undertake, the high-risk artificial intelligence systems would have to undertake a conformity assessment before they're placed in the market. And then once they're in the market, if there is an issue, an incident, for example, then there will be market surveillance authorities that will be charged with checking whether the artificial intelligence systems at hand has actually been compliant with the legislation. And the compliance with the legislation is checked against a certain number of requirements, which have been inspired by the work and the principles of the European high-level group on artificial intelligence, and which include, first of all, data and data governance, where we say that we would like artificial intelligence systems in high-risk context to make sure that they are based on the use of high-quality data sets. And this is very important because, as we all know, it is really the quality of the data sets that can make sure that we can minimize issues in terms of bias and discrimination, which are, the most important challenges that we are facing at the moment with artificial intelligence. And of course, there are other requirements. The other requirements are in terms of robustness, accuracy, security of the artificial intelligence systems, in terms of its transparency. And we will be checking whether the systems are compliant with these requirements before the system is put into place, as well as probably it could happen that this is checked also afterwards in case of an incident. So because of this, and our implementation is organized through certification bodies, conformity bodies, notifying bodies, as well as market surveillance authorities. And for this reason, these bodies may also have access may also ask to have access to the data sets that have been used to train and to test the artificial intelligence systems. Of course, always in full respect of our rules in terms of data protection. And because our approach is designed around the product market legislation that is in place, we also look at the importance of standardization in terms of its implementation. And in fact, we would like, and we are calling for the development, and we've already set a first mandate for the development of standards, exactly because we would like to be able to develop standards to facilitate the implementation and the compliance with the requirement. This is going to be very important for all companies, of course, who would like to sell in the European Union, but it is also in particular going to be very important for the small medium enterprises, because of course the development of European harmonized standards also facilitates the implementation and reduces also the cost for those who participate in the market. And so we have launched the adoption process for the first standardization request in this field. At the same time, we are collaborating very closely with the standardization community to really start working and continue working in this area. On the one hand, we understand and we realize that the international aspect of our work is particularly important, and so we intend to stimulate the use of international standards where they exist at the European level. Of course, international standards will also facilitate the participation of companies at the global level into the European market. On the other hand, we also want to be able to involve all stakeholders that are concerned. We cannot achieve our objectives unless the main stakeholders that are part of the artificial intelligence value chain are involved. So we need companies, and we need them big, but we also need the small and medium enterprises. This is crucial for artificial intelligence because here smaller companies are really playing a fundamental role. And on the other hand, we also need another kind of stakeholders. For example, if we consider the area of healthcare, we may need health professionals, or we may need some patients. And so we really also have to be able to reach out to the different kind of stakeholders that make up the ecosystem in the different sectors at hand. So let me conclude by saying that I welcome very much the workshop of today. I really thank the organizers, and I really would like to see a very important and serious discussion on how our policy and our legal concerns can really translate into high quality standardization. It will be a long journey, but I think it's a journey that needs to be lived, and I look forward to all the interesting discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very inspiring words, and also for the wealth of information that you have provided, and also the impetus, the motivation for these 2 days on all the data aspects related to the AI Act and the steps that have been taken so far, as well as the challenges ahead. You mentioned the connection with international bodies that are working on aspects and recommendations related to AI, and that introduces our next speaker, Dr. Gabriela Ramos, who is the Assistant Director General of UNESCO. Unfortunately, she was not able to join us today, but she sent a recorded video message to present today. So without further ado.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to participate in this workshop and to be able to discuss the urgent need to institute data quality standards to ensure the development of inclusive and trustworthy artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has the potential to immensely improve the life of humans around the world. Its applications are as varied as they are innovative. Today, AI is already being used to optimize food production, predict disaster risks, monitoring pollution, combating human trafficking, mapping infection disease outbreaks, among a host of other uses. It's adding this analytical power to the decisions that humans take in all realms of their lives. While being mindful of the utility that artificial intelligence offers, however, we must also acknowledge and respond to the risk of encoding into the digital world the biases, the discrimination, the inequalities that we found in the analog world. And without transparency, we would not even know that is happening. And unfortunately, many groups are already being left behind by the rapid pace of AI innovation and integration. there is a mounting evidence of serious gap in the gender and ethnic diversity of the AI research and industrial workforce. Indeed, the field of artificial intelligence has the largest gap in the tech industry, already characterized by wide gender disparities. Women represent only 22% of AI professionals, 20% of AI professors, and 13%, only 13% of AI research paper authors. This lack of gender diversity in AI research and development means that AI systems are in danger, and they're already doing it, of recreating and perpetuating existing forms of structural inequality against women, even when working as intended. This is because the research and development teams lacking diversity will be insufficiently aware of or sensitive to the risk the technologies that they develop pose to the more vulnerable groups, but also to gender in general. And this is half of the world population. Beyond the makeup of AI R&D teams, biases found in the datasets of artificial intelligence is trained also and plays a role in perpetuation of harmful stereotypes. Artificial intelligence systems are not being developed to recognize the full diversity of human beings, and studies have shown that voice and facial recognition software work much better for white males than for all the other groups. Such trends are particularly dangerous because they open the door to more serious forms of discrimination, especially in circumstances where AI decision-making can affect the health or human rights of individuals, or can affect also the opportunities that they are able to access. A solution to this risk can only result from a cross-sectoral, multidisciplinary, and collaborative approach, and one that engages all relevant stakeholders. The UNESCO's recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, adopted by acclamation last November by the organization's 193 member states, represents such an approach. Addressing the need for transparency, it calls upon member states to implement policies to promote and provide for diversity and inclusiveness, reflecting their populations in AI development teams and training datasets. This potentially includes investing in the creation of gold standard datasets, which are open, trustworthy, and diverse, as well as constructed on a valid legal basis, including the consent of data subject when required, and strengthened consent. The data of AI systems to be explainable is also emphasized by the recommendation, and standards for annotating datasets should be encouraged, including disaggregating data on gender and other bases, such that it can easily be determined how a dataset is gathered and what properties it has. Data quality standards, however, represent only one component on what must be a multifaceted response to the risk of AI, which locks up us in discriminatory trajectories. Furthermore, our efforts in this regard must be ongoing. The recommendation includes capacity building and assessment mechanisms to ensure the implementation. In particular, the readiness and ethical impact assessment tools. These tools apply to all stages of the life cycle of artificial intelligence and engage all relevant actors involved in the development and deployment, thereby allowing for the credible and transparent monitoring and evaluation of policies related to AI technologies. UNESCO is developing these tools with the help of a high-level expert group that, inter alia, include experts from the standardization domain. We are exploring synergies and working together to identify relevant methodologies used in standards that can be applied to these UNESCO tools, and we're ready to join forces with institutions and experts in this field. Given the need for cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary collaboration, this workshop characterizes a promising trend of increased cooperation. My hope is that by continuing to center ethics in the design, development, and deployment of AI, we can, at all states, institutions, and individuals, chart a collective path towards a more just and equitable future.
We would like to thank Ms. Ramos for her intervention and, of course, look forward to collaboration and cooperation with UNESCO on these important issues. To continue our journey in the stakeholder and also international organizations that are looking at AI and standards for components, including data of AI systems, I would like to give now the floor to Dr. Karine Perset, who is the head of unit of the AI unit in OECD. Thank you for joining us, and I leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to participate in this important workshop today by the European Commission with Centric on data quality requirements for inclusive, non-biased, and trustworthy AI. So this is the structure of my presentation. First, I will provide some brief background on OECD work and then give a short overview of 4 selected projects that I think can be relevant to today's workshop. First, the OECD framework for the classification of AI systems and AI risk assessment. Second, work on tracking AI incidents. Third, a catalog of tools for trustworthy AI that we have been developing and will launch in the fall. And lastly, some work towards accountability in AI. And in all of this work, we benefit from active cooperation with many institutions, including the European Commission and Centric. So this is, I think, work that we hope to contribute to these ongoing processes, in particular, the one we're discussing today. By way of background, the OECD put forth the OECD AI principles in May 2019. These principles were adopted by OECD member countries and also committed to by the G20, and they constitute the foundation of our work. The first 5 of these principles that you can see on the left-hand side are values-based principles related to ethical and safety questions for AI to be trustworthy and human-centric. And these apply to all actors. And the other 5 lay out key actions that policymakers need to implement in order to foster an AI ecosystem that can thrive on the long term and benefit societies. And these are very, very, very aligned with the work of both the European Commission and the UNESCO. I'd like to highlight, and we've benefited from close coordination and cooperation, as well as joint members in the groups that developed the proposals for these principles. So since the OECD AI principles were developed, we've been working on implementing or helping policymakers to implement them. And to do this, first we launched an AI Policy Observatory early 2020 to provide resources such as trends and data on AI developments to anchor policies and evidence, analysis of AI public policy topics, a joint European Commission OECD database of national AI initiatives from over 62 countries today, and soon also a catalog of tools to implement trustworthy AI. So these are resources for actors to use to inform policies. And secondly, we conduct analysis to translate the principles into practical guidance through work on national AI policies by the OECD Working Party on Artificial Intelligence Governance, known as IGO. And this working party oversees 3 multi-stakeholder expert groups of the network of experts on AI that help the OECD develop practical implementation guidance on AI classification and risk, AI tools and accountability, and measuring AI compute and climate components. Maybe just a few examples of some of the interactive visualizations on OECD.ai to assess AI developments by country and over time, which of course we invite you to explore. Moving on to the first project that I thought relevant to this workshop, which is our work on classifying AI systems. The rationale for this work is that AI is developing really fast in all areas of society, but there are just so many different types of AI systems that do very different things. And here, if you think about the difference between Siri on your phone, a cancer diagnosis system, or an autonomous vehicle, it's quite clear that these different systems raise completely different benefits and challenges for policy. And so the classification framework is really a structure that helps policymakers assess and classify, not just policymakers, but anybody assess and classify different types of AI systems according to their impact on the public policy areas covered by the OECD AI principles, including human rights, bias, safety, and accountability. So this is a synthetic view of the framework and the 5 dimensions, which are in the center, people and planet. So this is a cross-dimensional element that interacts with all of the framework dimensions. On the left, the economic context or environment in which the AI system operates, including its sector, such as healthcare, impact, and scale. Third, at the top, the data and input that will flow from the context to the AI system, including criteria like data collection method or whether the data is personal data. And this is the focus of today's workshop, this data dimension. Fourth, on the right, the AI model itself and the technologies that are used in it, including the type of model and model building process, like whether it uses machine learning or symbolic AI. And last, the task and output that flow from the AI model back to the context of the system, including the tasks the AI system performs, such as recognition or personalization, and how much autonomy the system has, like with a driverless car. So these simple dimensions include, I'll include a number of subdimensions or criteria. And in particular, I've highlighted red here, the type of data and input depend on its provenance, on the collection method, on the potential for identifiability of that data or input, as well as its appropriateness for the intended use, and of course its quality for that use. So these are all very relevant to privacy and to data governance. So we've mapped the key dimensions of the framework to different stages of the AI system life cycle, which was mentioned by Lucila previously, to help identify some of the key actors relevant to each dimension, including data collectors and processors for the data dimension, which is and this mapping key actors in these across the life cycle is very important to for accountability and risk management. So moving forward, this is just an illustration of a real application of this framework, where a group of health practitioners commissioned by the digital part of the UK health system are using the classification to frame key healthcare considerations that are shown on the slide, and this is also happening in the financial. Financial regulators are also considering or starting to use this framework. So moving onwards, the second project that I wanted to mention briefly with you is the Global AI Incident Tracker that will collect AI incidents and controversies from all over the world and try with the aim of creating the evidence base that governments need for effective AI policy, not just governments, I'm sorry, speaking from the perspective of governments, but here it's the entire community, all stakeholder groups need that evidence. And so the advantages, the goal of the tracker is to help avoid reproducing known incidents across jurisdictions, to provide a common framework for incident reporting, to build an evidence base that can help guide some of the regulatory choices we make, and document the characteristics of AI systems that are at the heart of actual incidents or near incidents, and then be able to use this information to assess the risk of AI systems in a systematic manner. This is just an example where we manually identified incidents, 900 incidents since 2019, and categorize them by sector. I'm sorry, that's not what I was trying to show. I was trying to show the previous slide, which is more relevant, I think, here, that really shows how, if you look at the incidents, again, this is not a representative, there are significant caveats with this data set, because these are only events that are, this is only based on news articles, and so it's not representative of all the incidents that are happening. But it's the tip of the iceberg, but it's what we have available publicly, so a significant sampling bias, but still you can see that bias and discrimination are the top cause of incidents in with AI systems that are reported in the media, of course, and then privacy and data governance are high up there too in terms of the risks. And so we think that this project will be very important to inform. And again, this is just to show some of the, based again on media articles, what are some of the key sectors in which AI incidents in the media are appearing. So moving, and what we're trying to do is automate this, automate the identification of AI incidents. And so this is just an example of automating whether an AI article corresponds to an incident or not, and we're working on that. So hopefully a part of it will be partially automated as one source of input into this tracker. Another third project that we're very excited about is the catalog of tools for trustworthy AI. So we've been working on this for a couple of years now, and the goal here is really to provide AI actors and policymakers with information on the latest tools to implement the principles in a practical way, or to implement trustworthy AI in a practical way. And so these are, what we mean by tools here are instruments and structured methods that people can use or reuse to help ensure their systems respect the OECD AI principles. And the idea is for the catalog to be very user-friendly, and we plan to keep it up to date through an open submission process. So here you can see a prototype of the catalog, which we're currently testing. As you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, once a tool is selected, the user will see a dashboard with all the resources related to this tool, including documentation on how to use it, links to its GitHub repository, related research, and of course, relevant blog posts and use cases of where existing actors have implemented that specific tool. And lastly, we're working on accountability in AI and on assessing risk. And this ties to the work on classification that I mentioned at the outset, and is really about the AI system as a whole, in addition to its components, including the data component, because a model won't work in isolation and is closely related to the other dimensions, including data and input. And so the goal here is really to contribute to the general understanding of key components of accountability in AI. And so this work uses the phases of a typical risk management framework, and it provides an overview of the concepts, tools, and processes that can enable the management of risks to the AI principles throughout the AI system lifecycle. And so what we see now here is just one table to illustrate some of the approaches to treat, prevent, mitigate risks of bias and discrimination. For example, the possibility to reweigh subjects during the data processing stage to better represent minorities. So those are the key projects that I wanted to highlight today. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for all the information, all the very rich information that you have provided us with regarding OECD efforts. It is indeed very interesting to see also the bias and discrimination are the main, let's say, issues related to AI systems incidents, so that hopefully the workshop today and tomorrow will also support forward into making sure that the right standards and guidelines are put into place so that does not happen. And with this, I would like to go on, and now we will have two interventions from Dr. Ansgar Kuhne, who is the chair of the IEEE working group on AI, and also Dr. Reva Schwartz, who is the principal investigator for AI bias in NIST. I give the floor to Dr. Kuhne. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be joining this session right now. So let me just ask, am I in control of the slides, or are you?
Livia is.
Okay. So if we can just go to the next slide. So I wanted to introduce, first of all, some of the bigger picture of the work that IEEE is doing in this space around AI standards, and especially around the ethics considerations around AI. So in 2016, towards the end of 2016, IEEE launched the Global Initiative on Ethics of Autonomous and Intelligent Systems. And this consists of a number of components, really. One part was the creation of a document looking into the ethical dimensions of AI called Ethically Aligned Design, a document co-created by the international community of IEEE members and also people from outside the IEEE who are engaged in this space. And in parallel with this work, IEEE launched its P7000 series of standards. So it's a series of standards looking to address ethical concerns regarding AI. The first of those being the 7000 standard model process for addressing ethical concerns during system design. So really the question how to integrate ethical thinking about the ethical issues into the design process. And then onwards towards topical ones such as transparency, data privacy, algorithmic bias, etc. This is an ongoing series, and there will be additional standards joining into this family. A number of them have been published by now, such as the 7000 model process, the transparency one, the ontological standard for ethically driven robotics, and recommended practice on assessing impact on human well-being. So if we go to the next slide, in addition to the work on sort of conceptual understanding of ethical issues, as well as the work on standards, IEEE has also initiated some work around certification. How can we certify whether AI systems are compliant with various concerns around, be it transparency, be it accountability, be it bias, or also privacy issues. And so this is a piece of work, the ethics certification program for autonomous and intelligent system, that is now progressing into an actual certification offering. If we move on to the next slide. So the focus of the work that I'm engaged with IEEE is around algorithmic bias considerations. And I'd like to just first start off with why we chose the title of the standard to be bias considerations, as opposed to something like removal of bias or unbiased systems. And that is, to begin with, that bias very much depends on the perspective from which a system is being approached. And as such, any system that really produces outcomes that aren't uniform random distributions can be considered to be biased if one doesn't understand what the system is particularly looking to achieve. So really what the standards is looking to do is to minimize unintended, unjustified, or unacceptable kinds of bias or differentiation in outcomes. And to achieve this, it's really focusing on the process through which the system is being developed, providing guidance on the kinds of considerations that the development community, but also the deployers of AI systems need to take into account in order to ensure that systems are being used in the correct context for which they were being created, but also that during the creation, a sufficient understanding is present regarding the stakeholders, the community that will be impacted by the system, and the relevant requirements that stem from this. So if we go to the next slide. So the general overview of how the 7003 algorithmic bias consideration standard seeks to approach this challenge is to say, first of all, the considerations that are going to be put forward in the standard need to be revisited at multiple stages of an AI system's design life cycle or also deployment stages. And so there are 5 main elements to what needs to be addressed. First of all, being clear as to the requirements for bias consideration. So understanding what is the use case context for which a system is being developed, but also what are actually the core values that the particular organization is seeking to achieve with the system. For instance, identifying, does the organization, for instance, have AI principles that they have published? And so therefore, are we operationalizing the AI system in that context and really achieving some performance that matches what we have publicly communicated as being the values that the organization stands for? Once the requirements of the AI system are somewhat clarified, and I say somewhat because this is something that also needs to be revisited as the process is as one is going through the process, then it is necessary to clearly identify who the stakeholders are. This includes both the internal stakeholders, the parties involved in developing the system. This addresses, for instance, questions around the diversity of the developers, but also the external parties, both the users of the system, but also regulators or other parties that could be indirectly impacted by the system. These need to be clearly identified and mapped in order to enable what is really the focus of the next stage, which is assessing the representativeness of the data. One cannot really identify whether the data is properly representative of the impacted stakeholders if one does not know the stakeholders. And so this data representativeness, as was already indicated earlier, is a core question around a lot of this technology, because data is such a strong driver around its performance. And then the next stage is a risk and impact assessment process, which is followed by a system evaluation, really to ensure that the intended performance is actually being achieved, and that the way in which the system operationalizes its task and differentiates outputs according to inputs, that those differentiations match the intended purpose and are not introducing unintended kinds of bias. So this is the high-level kind of overview of the way in which this standard is seeking to approach the challenges around algorithmic bias considerations. And really at the core of all of this is documentation, being clear and documenting all of the decisions that are being made in the development cycle in order to be able to clearly assess whether the intended purposes are being achieved. And then I think the next slide is probably the end. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the richness of information and also all the details, particularly on the data bias part. We will have very interesting discussions also in the panels regarding all these details, and I think they're a very good wealth of information to accompany us on this journey. Thank you so much for coming. Next, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Reva Schwartz, who is the principal investigator for AI bias in NIST, and she will be talking to us about their recent paper on data bias. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, not sure if I'm on screen yet.
Yes, we can see you and we can hear you as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. I was unsure. I will continue.
No worries.
I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation and for hosting this event. Sorry for that little delay. My name is Reva Schwartz. I'm here to talk about the work we're doing at NIST in the area of trustworthy and responsible AI. As you're probably aware, NIST is in the developing stages of the AI risk management framework. The focus of our work in the AI RMF is that while AI has great promise, as we've heard today and we all are aware, it comes with real risks and can cause real world negative impacts and harms. One of those risks is bias, and mitigating bias is a key characteristic of trustworthy AI. So we recently published a document about bias called Towards a Standard for Identifying and Mitigating Bias in Artificial Intelligence, also called NIST Special Publication 1270. This work is part of the AI RMF and its resource center. SP 1270 was a result of an extensive literature review. It contains 285 references, conversations with experts in the field, a workshop, and a series of public comments on the draft version. The next slide, please. So in 1270, we discussed the reality that there is more to bias than computational bias. We described two other significant sources of bias in AI, and we found that the current exclusive focus on computational bias is keeping us disconnected from the reality of how AI systems are built within and connect to society. In the interest of time, I'm only going to briefly introduce the other two categories. First, we have human cognitive biases. You see those there in green on the graph. These are prevalent in the decision-making processes across the AI lifecycle and in the use of AI once it's deployed. Second, we have systemic bias. That's up there in purple. This is a bit like cognitive bias at an organizational level. And these are the implicit and pervasive drivers for how institutions make decisions, both good and bad. These biases are prevalent in the data, the models, and the organizational assumptions, practices, and norms where AI is produced. The next slide, please. So this graphic shows that by exclusively focusing on computational bias, we are obfuscating the very real impacts of the other two categories. Human cognitive and systemic biases are prevalent across AI, more entrenched than currently perceived, and difficult, some might say impossible, to observe and measure. Currently, our measurement approaches for those types of bias within AI are often poorly constructed, invalid, or invalidated. In addition, as you can see on the right side, the way tech is brought to market is not, at least for right now, set up to identify, assess, and prevent harms. One of the key things we're trying to accomplish with the AI risk management framework, along with similar frameworks and approaches, is to tighten up these processes to integrate the consideration of contextual and societal factors. So right now, it's common to see practices that are disconnected from context. Things such as selecting data sets based on what's easily available or accessible instead of what is suitable, and testing on optimized scenarios. And of course, every time we expand the distance between what was tested for in production and how it's actually used, we get further from our target measures. Next slide, please. In SP 1270 and the risk management framework, we advocate for a socio-technical systems approach. That term, socio-technical, just means that we're taking into consideration the larger social system in which AI operates, its purpose and potential impacts. But by designing and building AI systems connected to how they will be used in context, we can improve performance. We can do this with a few broad strategies. In the map stage of the AI risk management framework, we advocate for broadening our perspectives to help bring in context, improve processes for enumerating limitations and negative impacts. This will require making real space for different disciplines internally and engaging stakeholders externally. In the measure stage of the RMF, we advocate for the need to adhere to and maintain scientific integrity. In both the map and manage stage of the AIRMF, we discussed the need to recognize, acknowledge, and document the limitations in the data, model, system, and procedures, and how our assumptions might be contributing to those limitations. And of course, in the governance stage, we described the need for strong governance practices and organizational buy-in. In bias, this can help combat issues with systemic bias and change norms from an exclusive focus on system optimization to consideration of context and societal impact and societal values. Next slide. So I just want to end by discussing some key factors specific to data, since this is what this workshop is about. Related to scientific integrity and data and the metrics we currently use in bias assessment. Right now, there is this belief that if we get perfectly balanced data sets and along with model optimization, we can solve the problem of bias. But we keep seeing incidents where systems that utilize perfectly balanced data sets and perform with perfect accuracy are still contributing to significant harmful outcomes in the real world. And as we just heard, and we're all aware, we see evidence of these incidents almost weekly. And it's also likely we're only seeing a sample of what's really happening. So what we're advocating, or our point here, is that balancing representation in data sets, which is a common practice and necessary, is merely a first step in addressing bias. We need to recognize that mathematical abstractions are actually limited when addressing context. And this gets to the iceberg. We're so focused on computation that we're missing the context. So we need to augment current approaches with techniques that engage social science methods to determine what constitutes representation in a given context or a given use case. We need to accept that in many cases, protected attributes and outcomes are in fact not independent. And that's certainly the case as relates to systemic and cognitive biases. So we advocate for construct validation and other types of measurement models to ensure that the socially constructed indices or proxies that are in use today, such as creditworthiness or hireability, are actually indicative of the intended phenomenon that they are trying to measure, that they are in fact observable and measurable, because if and when they are not, they will and do cause significant problems. Later this summer, we'll release our second draft of the AI risk management framework, along with specific guidance, including for identifying and managing AI bias. So I'm going to end there so I don't go over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining, and thank you for the very rich information that you have provided and on all the work that NIST is doing on this in this field. And indeed, I think we have seen in the different talks so far that there is the part on AI bias and discrimination potential, but that is all very much linked to the societal biases and discrimination and let's say differences on which the data is actually built, and also on which, of course, the AI systems are eventually trained. So it is indeed very important to keep in mind that we are not building AI systems in the void, and we're not gathering data from other planets, but it is about us, and the human and social context are so important. Talking about us and Europe and the EU and the European Commission, I would like to invite now Dr. Gabriela Mazzini, who is the team leader for the AI Act in DG Connect, and he will be talking to us about the data in the context of the AI Act. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Excellent. So thanks so much for the invitation. And indeed, I'll spend my 10 minutes giving you a bit of a flavor or an overview of what are the requirements for data in the proposal for the AI Act. But before I actually get into the specific article on the requirement for data, which is Article 10, I want a bit to give you also a bit more of a background about the way these requirements function. In fact, if you go to the next slide, perhaps the first important element to know about compliance with the requirements. So with all the requirements. And here we're talking about the 5 requirements for AI systems, which are the one related to data we are discussing today. And then we have transparency, human oversight, the requirement on cybersecurity, accuracy, and robustness, and the requirement on record keeping. So all these requirements have to be met by the AI system before it's placed on the market. And now an important provision related in the chapter regarding the requirements is this Article 8. Article 8 states indeed that the high-risk AI systems, by the way, the compliance, these 5 requirements are foreseen only for those systems that are classified by the AI Act as high risk, so not for all AI systems. So AI risk AI systems shall comply with the requirements, and the second paragraph states that it's in the intended purpose of the high risk AI system, and the risk management system shall be taken into account. So these 2 concepts are essential when it comes to compliance with the requirements. Next slide, please. So first, we need to completely understand what is the intended purpose. We define intended purpose as the use for which an AI system is intended by the provider, so the manufacturer, including the specific context and conditions of use that are specified in the information supplied by the provider. So this is a concept that is fairly common and understood in all product legislation in the EU, because indeed the product has to be safe and compliant with the law in connection with the intended purpose that is determined by the provider. This is an important factor, but this concept of intended purpose is extremely relevant also for other purposes. For instance, the AI Act classifies certain AI systems as high risk based indeed on intended purpose. You can refer here, for instance, to our Article 6 and the Annex 3. And of course, also for compliance with the requirements. As I just said, the intended purpose always has to be taken into account when ensuring compliance with the requirements, including, of course, the requirement for data. Next slide, please. The second element that is referred to in Article 8, which is sort of the chapeau article, which provides the introduction to all the requirements, is the risk management system. This is probably a concept that is, I'm sure, as most of you are familiar. So it's really, we are referring here also again, not to something that is completely unknown or we have invented in the Act. This is absolutely common in all product legislation. It's the process whereby the manufacturer, throughout the whole life cycle of the AI system, in particular of the product, has to identify and evaluate the risks that are associated with the product. In this case, also including, we have foreseen also a system of post-market monitoring, meaning that also when the system has been placed by the market, on the market by the provider, it has to continuously iterate on ensuring that indeed the risks identified and evaluated have been properly been taken into account. Then, of course, based on the identification evaluation of the risk management measures have to be adopted, and this corresponds also to a bit of the classical approach whereby first you eliminate or reduce the risk through design and development. Those that you cannot eliminate or reduce, you mitigate or control for them with additional measures. And in the case there are even additional residual risk, then of course you have to inform the user or train the user for the type of risks. And here we enter indeed into an area, for instance, like human oversight. Now, the risk management system article foresees explicitly that due consideration has to be given to the effects and possible interaction resulting from the combined application of the requirements. So the 5 requirements I mentioned, they have to be applied together. So the manufacturers have to consider the compliance with the requirements, taking into account also the fact that these requirements have to interact with each other. And so perhaps some trade-offs need to be made. And this is also an extremely important element, taking into account also the generally acknowledged state of the art. The idea is that we are not going to ask what is not feasible. And this is extremely important, also specifically with regard to the data requirement. So moving on indeed to the data requirement, the next slide, please. So the article on data requirements, the data and data governance, The first part, the first paragraph states that AI system needs to be developed with appropriate data governance and management practices. What are they? So the goal, of course, is to ensure that we are training the system, or we are using data that is of high quality. These practices involve regard, for instance, the design choices, the processes for data collection, but also data preparation and processing. So notably on annotation, labeling, cleaning, enrichment, and so forth. The formulation of relevant assumption. This was just mentioned, I think, in the previous speakers' presentations. Indeed, what is that the data are supposed to measure? What is that the data are supposed to represent? Then there should be an assessment on the availability, quantity, and suitability of the data sets needed, always in relation to the intended purpose of the AI system. Examination of possible bias, again, something that was just discussed, and also identification of data gaps, as well as shortcomings, and how this could be addressed. Next slide, please. Then we come to other paragraphs of Article 10, which specifically refer to the fact that the training, validation, and testing data set should be relevant, representative, free of errors, complete, and with the appropriate statistical properties, including as regards the person to which the system intended to be used. And here I want indeed to circle back with what I just referred to as regards the state of the art. I know this provision has been the subject of criticism, notably with regard to the reference, for instance, to the free of errors was complete, which is indeed considered to be an impossible standard to meet. And in fact, this has to be read in conjunction with the reference to the state of the art, which is included, in fact, in Article 9. Then it's also, there is another specific provisions which refers to the fact that the data sets have to take into account the specific geographical behavior or functional setting within which their system is intended to be used. These expressions are somewhat a bit cryptic, or at least been perceived sometimes as cryptic. What we're referring to here is to the fact this is sort of a subcategory of, if I may say, representatives of the data set of the specific context where the AI system is supposed to be used. For instance, if I'm training my AI system on certain type of streets in a certain country, perhaps that same training would not maybe fit for streets in a different country because, let's say, street signs are looking a bit different. So it's important that the data sets reflect the specific context. Same for sort of behavioral. To the extent data sets are supposed to measure, say, certain type of medical practice, it's important to ensure that that medical practice is indeed used in the same way, both in the place where the system is trained and the place where the system is supposed to be then deployed. Or functional setting. For instance, it's important if I'm developing a system relating, for instance, for the allocation of certain social security benefits. Social security benefits are normally something that is strictly regulated by national law. So the conditions under which people can obtain certain security benefits. So it's important then to take into account when training the system, also the specific context linked to the, if you want, the legal or the legal framework that determines indeed also what the data should measure, what the data should represent. And linked to this specific requirement about the specific context, the AI Act foresees also a presumption of compliance with these requirements if the AI system indeed has been trained on and tested on data that specifically emanate from that geographical behavioral functional setting. And finally, the last provision I want to mention is the fact that we foresee a specific legal basis for the processing of special categories of personal data. These are, for instance, those data that reveal racial or ethnic origin or data related to your health condition for the purpose of ensuring bias monitoring, detection, and correction. So we want to make sure that in certain cases, there must be the possibility for developer indeed to specifically process those type of data, even though given their sensitivity, often data protection legislation foresees certain restrictions. And I think this is my last slide. So thank you for your attention. And yes, thanks again.
Thank you very much for all the information you have shared with us and all the details on the AI provisions and AI Act provisions and guidelines that you are working on so far. Further on, as we have seen, there are many different initiatives that are now taking place in different parts of the world and by different organizations to look at AI standards, guidelines, recommendations, and now to finalize our open session, our keynote speakers interventions, I would like to invite Dr. Sebastian Hallesleben, who is the chair of Centric JTC 21 group on AI, in order to talk to us about standardization efforts going on in EXO. Thank you.
And in fact, Patrick Buzon and myself will have decided to go the reverse order. So we'll start at the international level, which Patrick will present, and I'll take over seamlessly from him for the European level. So over to you, Patrick.
Yes, thank you very much, Sebastian. Well, actually, I'm Patrick Buzon, so Vice Chair of the JTC 21. Working closely with Sebastian. It happens that I'm also very much involved in ISO IEC as I am the convener of the advisory group 3, which is on AI standardization road mapping. And this gives me a very broad overview of what's going on within the SC42, which is dedicated to artificial intelligence. Next slide. Okay, so where are we now within the SC42? We have 35 standards published under development and many more to come. So as you could guess, the scope of AI standardization is going to be very broad. We have 2 foundational standards that are going to be key on terminology. Terminology is very, very important. If we don't speak the same language, we won't understand each other. So it is really important that when we use some terms like robustness, we all share the same understanding of what is robustness. Same with explainability, transparency, and whatever. So we have one standard on AI management system, which is under development and which should be finished, I believe, sometime this year. And we have 11 standards on what I call trustworthiness characteristics, all the fancy terms that we're using, safety, robustness, controllability, explainability, quality bias, plenty of things that needs to be clarified in order to that we understand exactly what we are talking about. On top of that, we have 4 international standards projects on data quality. Those are quite early stage, but very well much advanced right now. We still have a couple of gaps that we have to acknowledge on some trustworthiness characteristics like AI oversight, sustainability, accuracy, fairness. Although fairness could be very much related to bias, and we have already something covering that. We have another gap, which is on verifiable technical specification, metrics, and controls. So so far, we're starting to work on technical requirements, if I may say. It's nice to have a standard explaining what is a concept, what is robustness, but it's better, much better to have all the technical requirements that would support the developers into developing the products on assess the conformity of that product to those technical requirements. We have future potential work items that are going to be launched. We have one item on mitigating ethical and social concerns. I haven't mentioned it here, but we have another one that might be launched by October, which is on the environmental AI sustainability, which could support the Green Deal on the open side, but we'll see that later. Next slide. So I tried to put on a single slide the few standards that I think would support the concerns identified within this workshop. So we have 6 actually standards that could be of help. We have 2 technical reports, the one in green, one on overview of ethical and social concern, one on bias in AI systems. And we have 4 standards that are being developed regarding data quality. Data quality, well, of course, the terminology, but also the measures, the requirements on the framework. Those last 4 are going to be considered by Centric and JTC 21 as potential as candidate for potential harmonized standards at a later stage. So as you may see, there are plenty of things going on within ISO AC SC42. On ISO AC SC42 and JTC 21 are very much linked, and now I hand over to Sebastian to present what's going on within JTC 21.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, for the introduction of the international level. And I think we have to remind ourselves that international and European standardization for AI have fairly different approaches and also fairly different overall objectives. So right now, the biggest objective within European AI standardization is to support European Union legislation, including supporting and underpinning the AI Act that is under development right now with harmonized standards, but also a little bit further down the line to support and underpin other European Union legislation, for example, in the field of data regulation or in the field of sustainability. At the same time, there is some similarity between European and international objectives in that we want to support industry needs, but of course the interests of European industry are not necessarily identical with the interests of industries globally on a worldwide level, so there is a certain divergence there as well. Having said that, there is a strong interest among both European companies and global companies to have as little divergence between European and international standards as possible in the field of AI, because that, of course, makes doing business much easier and reduces friction in international trade and international business activity. Also important from an industry perspective is a unified perspective, that we're not just looking at the product perspective that is core to the AI Act, but that we're also looking at organizational and process perspectives, which are reflected in more depth on the international level. So it's really about trying to combine both levels into a coherent whole that is easily accessible for industry. And that takes us to the next slide, please. It takes us really to the question, so what makes good European AI standards? How can we tell in JTC 21 that we are doing a good job? So first of all, as just mentioned, there is no point in reinventing the wheel. So if for a specific topic, there is already an ISO IEC standard available or nearly finished, there is no point duplicating that work at the European stage. Also, in Europe, we put a lot of emphasis on making standards actionable. So that means that the standard should help companies, not just in terms of having good practice, but also in terms of telling them exactly what they need to do to meet a certain need, what they need to do to operationalize certain specifications or metrics, and what they need to do in order to bring innovation forward. Secondly, a good European standard is, of course, coherent with other standards and frameworks. And we've listed here a whole range, but non-comprehensive range of organizations that are active in the field of AI standardization in a broader sense. And we've been lucky enough to hear from some of them earlier today, including OECD and Unesco and Ieee. There are few things that are worse for users of standards like organizations, companies, civil society organizations, than different families of standards that are conflicting and that don't really fit together. So that's a really big goal, to have a coherent approach. Also, given that the AI Act is not specific to a specific sector, so it takes a horizontal approach, we also need to strive to find horizontal approaches in European AI standardization. Of course, at some point we will need to go into verticals, but we do have to make sure that a certain foundation of standards is horizontal. And then, of course, what makes a good European AI set of standards is satisfying European specificities and requirements. We take it for granted, but it is important that standards also reflect the fact that certain European values and principles, including protections for citizens and protections for consumers, need to be achieved. And of course, it's not the role of standards to express values and principles, but it is the role of standards to provide ways of achieving or of implementing values and principles. And as mentioned, the timeline set by the European AI Act, autumn 2024, is certainly a European specificity that is not present at the international level and puts us under a different kind of pressure. And finally, the European Union likes to see itself as a third force on the globe that somehow implements a third way of handling AI. And I would take that one step further and not just saying, oh, we somehow provide an alternative to how AI is being handled in China or in the US, but that we're also striving to provide maybe the better alternative and have the confidence to be a global standard setter, not just a standard taker, in line with the European standardization strategy as presented by the Commission in February this year. Next slide, please. So what does it mean in practical terms? The to-do list is quite straightforward. So we started already a year, maybe even 2 years ago, anticipating the AI Act and working on a standardization roadmap since June last year within the framework of JTC 21. We've now received the initial draft of the standardization request from the European Union, from the European Commission, and the feedback process on that is ongoing. And we're now just maybe a month or two away from having a very solid basis for standardization work as requested by the Commission based on the AI Act. The next step is the actual work to create those standards, either homegrown standards or adapted from international level, which will happen in JTC 21, but also in close collaboration with ETSI. And finally, we do need to consider very, very carefully where we use our own European capability to create standards and where we adopt or adapt international standards. This will happen on a case-by-case basis, and the cases are clear-cut where there is no international standard. It's very easy. We have to build one at the European level very quickly. It's also easy in cases where there is already a finished or almost finished international standard, for example, for terminology. But it is a lot more difficult in cases where there is some international work, but where it's not yet clear whether it will come to fruition quickly enough and whether it will satisfy all the European needs once it's finished. And there we will have to take a case-by-case guess, an educated guess, and respond accordingly with a combination of European work and international collaboration. And the final slide, please. So this is just a very broad sketch of some of the topics that are now becoming relevant in European AI standardization. So I already mentioned that we're in the process of adopting or adapting terminology standards from the international level. We're also in the process of analyzing AI management systems and AI risk management. Again, there is a lot of work at the international level that's already available or ongoing, but the assumption is that it will not be an outright adoption. There will be some European specificities that need to be taken into account. And in particular in the area of classifying and cataloging risk, which also touches on the OECD work that Karim Passy has presented earlier. Also, an important topic at the European level is, of course, trustworthiness, which also includes the considerations that are sometimes grouped under the heading AI ethics. There are numerous initiatives, there are many standards, but there are also gaps. There's some coverage of EU requirements, so it's a fairly complex field, and where we fortunately do not start from scratch, but where the challenge is more or lies in making some sense, getting some structure into all the work that already exists, and distilling it, merging it into something that can support the AI Act. Conformity assessment is the next topic that is very closely tied to regulation, and hence something that will almost certainly happen mostly at the European rather than in international level. And finally, for data and for data governance, the jury is still out how we are going to approach this. So analysis is just getting underway on how to respond to those requirements. And with this, I'd like to thank you and hand back to Alexandra.
Thank you very much, both to Dr. Hallesleben and Dr. Bazombes for the introduction into the ISO and ESO standardization efforts so far. And as we have seen, there's been a long way until now, but there is still a long road ahead. So now, because we are already late, and there are a few questions still on Slido, and there is one in the QA in the chat. But I propose that we send the questions to the speakers, and we will share the answers with the participants so that we can move on to the first two parallel sessions that will be hopefully supporting all this upcoming work that is needed in standards and guidelines for data in AI before and after being used in AI systems. So I invite you to click on one of the two links that my colleagues have put in the chat